participants for this discussion. Now I request Dr. Archana Verma ma'am to escort Ambassador Kanwal Sibal sir to the stage. India has come a long way in the international world order, yet it isn't spared from external shocks. Emerging as the champion of non-alignments in the 1960s era to taking stands in favor of national interest, with her neighbors being influenced by China's soft power and ever-increasing trade deficit with it. India as a game leader in the South Asia is being challenged for it. As much as the dependence on the Middle East for fossil fuel exposes India's vulnerability. The question lingers on her inability to promise net zero emissions by 2070. Moreover, is the bilateral ties with USA leading her to dependence or self-reliability? The current implications of Russia-Ukraine conflict has compelled India to take sides despite going against popular opinion for her defense support and business ties are at stake. In a nutshell, how in peril India is to happenings at superficial level. Padma Shri awardee Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, who is a retired Indian diplomat with an exceptional career spanning over 41 years, embellished with holding the highest position in the Indian Foreign Services on his appointment as the Foreign Secretary to the Government of India from July 2002 to November 2003. Has held several ambassadorial level positions, including serving as India's ambassador to Turkey, France, Egypt, and to Russia. Besides having served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C. with an ambassadorial rank. He was a member of India's National Security Advisory Board from 2008 to 2010. Dr. Sibal is the first Grand Doctor of Philosophy in India, and he also writes regularly for the national journals on international affairs. Now I hand it over to the moderators for the session, Tanish Gadam and R.N. Gado.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Sibal, let's begin the discussion today. It is indeed an honor. So the format of the discussion would be that we have prepared a large array of questions for you, and we have selected a few questions. So those would be the moderated side of the discussion, post which we'll proceed with the audience questions. I hope that you will.
That's fine.
Sir, so firstly, my name is Tanish Gadam, and I'm a third-year student of political science. And I also serve as the president of Caucus, the discussion forum, which is the official organizer of today's session. So it is indeed an honor for Hindu College to have Ambassador Sibal with us, not only because he was in the uppermost echelons of power as the India's foreign policy machinery is concerned, but also because the sheer temporal aspect of his knowledge, he has been an ardent observer of India's relations and international affairs for more than 50 years now. And I'm sure that after this discussion, almost all of us would be more informed about a topic that is prone to shocks, India and the world. So my first question is about a very trending topic recently, the Ukrainian-Russia crisis. So this topic, as you have repeatedly commented as well in national dailies, has a lot of complex nuances to it and a very deep historical background. So how do you read the situation in Ukraine, and how do you evaluate India's immediate response? And in addition to that, what would be an ideal response by India in the long term?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the origins of this crisis in Ukraine, because the narrative is dominated by the West. Our press, unfortunately, has not played the role it ought to have played in order to inform our public about various aspects of this issue in a balanced manner. What they have really done is to publish whatever material they are getting from Western news agencies, Western governments, Western spokesperson, without any consideration being given to what should be our optic on this. Where do our interests lie? Whether the information that is being circulated meets India's requirements in some way, in the sense that there should not be a gap in understanding between the issues involved in Ukraine and how they impact on our national interests. Unfortunately, I've been quite frustrated at the manner in which there is unwillingness, not only in terms of newspaper reports, but also editorials. Now let me explain a little bit, since I was ambassador to Russia, so I have some direct understanding of the background to this. You see, the great failure of Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union has been to develop a security architecture in Europe which would meet the needs of the situation created after the demise of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union as a communist power. Now, at that time, the Russians, actually, even President Putin, were willing to join NATO. They looked upon NATO prospectively with the new Russia as a common home for Europe. And instead of the divide that was there during the Cold War, to have a situation where no one would feel its security is threatened. Anyway, the long and short is that NATO kept expanding, and it has expanded 5 times since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were 14 members of NATO when the Soviet Union existed. Today there are 30. And this has been done in phases. Russia has always protested against this expansion, but their protests were not heeded. In 2008, NATO membership was offered to Georgia and Ukraine. Before that, the East European countries, the Central European countries, and the Baltic states had become members of NATO. But Russia was extremely sensitive about Ukraine and Georgia becoming members of NATO, because these were the constituent parts of the Soviet Union. And if you look at the geography of this area, especially Ukraine, it's totally flat land. There's no defense at all. And if Ukraine had become a member of NATO, and if NATO positioned its forces and its strike weapons there, then Russia had no security. So in 2008, Saakashvili, who was the president of Georgia, encouraged by the offer of membership of NATO, did something within Georgia. I won't go into details. The result of which was that Russia intervened. And Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which were separatist regions in Georgia, they became independent, and Russia recognized their independence. This was a warning signal to the West that if you fiddle with Ukraine, then Russia could do the same thing. In 2014, the legitimately elected president, Yanukovych of Ukraine, was overthrown by Maidan protests in which the United States was visibly present. Now, the parallel would be, but not quite the thing, that if, for example, we had these protests in Delhi, and if the American ambassador went there and started distributing sweets to those people. Actually, this is what happened. Victoria Nuland, who's today the Undersecretary in the State Department, was Assistant Secretary then. She came to Kiev and actually went to the Maidan protests and distributed cookies to the protesters. Anyway, the long and short is that when Yanukovych was overthrown in the street coup, Russia annexed Crimea. following which there were negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, brokered by the OSCE, resulting in the Minsk agreements, which, if you look at them, make a lot of sense. What they really said was that the eastern Ukraine, the Luhansk and the Donetsk republics, should get autonomy, constitutional autonomy, that the constitution should be amended, and then there would be elections in these two provinces to elect their own government, following which the frontiers between Russia and Ukraine could be manned by the Ukrainian army. Putin waited 7 years for the Minsk agreements to be implemented. And don't forget, the UN Security Council ratified these, which means America ratified these agreements, but behind the scenes did not allow them to be implemented. Now, the Eastern is giving you a long answer, but I think it's necessary because it is the topic of the day. Eastern Ukraine is very different from Western Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is largely Russian-speaking, ethnic Russian region. But beyond the Dnieper River, especially the Western Ukraine, these were territories that were incorporated by Stalin into Russia, into the Soviet Union. They are Catholics. They are not Russian-speaking. They are not Orthodox Christians. So there is the religious divide. And this has always been the core of Ukrainian nationalism, because they felt that they had been forced into the Soviet Union by Stalin. And they thought of themselves as Germanic and Lithuanian and this and that, and had great contempt for the Slavs. And that's why they cooperated with Nazi Germany. And today, people like Bandera, who was pro-Nazi Ukrainian, are seen as heroes in Ukraine. Anyway, the long and short is that there is an internal divide between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, and that has complicated matters a great deal. The Ukrainians, nationalists, are now in power. Today they are being armed openly by the West. Since 2014, actually NATO has been on the ground, even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO, they have been on the ground in terms of training. The special forces have been there. And now they are openly, as you know, supplying arms. America has recently, the Congress has approved funds of $800 million for arms supplies to Ukraine. Before that, about $300 million worth of arms was sent in. The British are very deeply involved in Ukraine. In 2019, a special agreement was done between NATO and Ukraine, which openly says that Ukraine's NATO membership would be accelerated. This is the background for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the question is India's position. Now, it is very simplistic to say that India should condemn the invasion. If we condemn the invasion, then we have to also criticize and condemn all the actions that led to it. You can't simplistically say that this is wrong and overlook the fact that NATO has been extended relentlessly, disregarding the Russian security. Our statements in the UN Security Council and the UNGA, where we have abstained on these resolutions, has been very carefully crafted, where without condemning Russia, we have said that the UN Charter should be observed, the territorial integrity of nations should not be violated, their sovereignty should not be violated. We want negotiations to start and a peaceful solution found to the conflict. Our immediate interest at that time was to evacuate our 20,000 students largely, for which we needed cooperation both from Russia and Ukraine, which we did. We have agreed to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Don't forget that some of our military equipment, especially the naval equipment, the frigates that come from Russia, are powered by engines manufactured in Ukraine. So there is a kind of a dependency also in terms of our platforms that we get from Russia. So we have no interest in seeing the situation deteriorate and worsen, but we are not players in this. The United States is now openly wanting a regime change in Moscow. Biden has said so in as many words. The National Security Advisor has said so in so many words. They want to isolate Russia, economically weaken it, and their assumption is that this will result in a revolt against Putin and the entire system would collapse. And they are openly saying that this is what they are hoping for. The point is it in our interest? Well, what harm has Russia done to us? Ukrainians can say what they want, Europeans can say what they want, but what harm has Russia done to us? It's always been our friend. It has not attacked us. It has never sanctioned us. We have a limited but important relationship with Russia, and I want to spell it out a little bit. Our relationship with the United States is very vast, very wide-ranging. It is incomparable in terms of our relations with Russia. We have now $160 billion of trade with the United States. We have over 200,000 students who are studying there. We have about 4 to 5 million diaspora in the United States. In terms of foreign investment, technologies in order to modernize our economic system, management issues, all that, Russia, the United States is our biggest partner. Our entire IT sector is very deeply linked to the United States. So if you look at the future, our Prime Minister was not wrong in saying a few days ago that he foresees the United States as our development partner for the next 25 years. This is the reality. With Russia, in contrast, we have about 15,000 students. The trade is less than $10 billion. We have virtually no diaspora. We have no diaspora there. However, in the areas of defense and energy, we have some vital interests in Russia. 60 to 70% of our defense platforms are still of Russian origin. We need spare parts, we need servicing. There are platforms which, and technologies, and I know this as having been ambassador to Russia, which no other country supplies to us. They are the ones who have given us the capacity to develop our nuclear-powered submarines. Now we are getting the S-400 from them. In the missile sector, they have been helping us in a very sensitive way. So the short point is that our relationship with the United States meets certain needs of ours. And our smaller relationship with Russia also meets certain specific needs of ours. So there is no either-or situation or that we are compelled to make a choice. Why should we make a choice? The argument of the West that you should make a choice can be reversed and said, well, have you ever made a choice when it came to India's core security interests? You always sided with Pakistan, traditionally. Today you handed over Afghanistan to the Taliban and the Pakistan, given Pakistan the strategic depth they wanted without consideration to our security. You have on China, you have built China over these recent decades into a formidable power. You have not chosen democratic India to build India, you have chosen to build communist, autocratic China. And then you say that Ukraine is a battle between democracies and autocracies, but you have built the biggest and the most powerful autocracy in the world yourself. And insofar as the moral argument is concerned, I mean, who destroyed Iraq, who destroyed Syria, who destroyed Libya, who destroyed Yugoslavia? So if you tell us that you have, as a democracy, you are morally obliged, but then as a democracy you are morally obliged also to take note of the fact that the West has done all these things. So our position is the right one. It meets our national interests, even though we have come under criticism in the West at the leadership level as well as the press and media in particular. But we have to stand our ground. And the last point I want to make, maybe I've anticipated some of your questions, is that after the phase of unilateralism of the United States, what was the reaction of the rest of the world, including countries in Europe, especially France? Multipolarity. That the world cannot accept that a single power should be able to do what it wants without any checks and balances. There has to be an alternative voice, which is a non-Western voice, which should have a say in international governance, and that's the root of the Russia-India-China dialogue, BRICS, and later SCO, this and that. Now today you find that that phase of unilateralism has come back with the consolidation of the United States European alliance. And see what they have done. They have confiscated, they have frozen the foreign exchange reserves of Russia. They have imposed wide-ranging sanctions, including against Putin and Lavrov, 358 members of the Russian parliament. They have confiscated the properties of the oligarchs without due process of law. They threatened to throw out Russia from WTO. All these sanctions have no legal basis. No legal basis at all. In fact, they have created such a huge problem for the rest of the world that the existing international order which the United States principally built is being destroyed by the United States of America. And anything that we have in terms of assets, properties, foreign exchange reserves, whatever, in the West can at a stroke of a pen be finished. You have no right to it. This is what's happened to a power like Russia. It can happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen to India, but you have to see ahead what the implications of this are in terms of the global system. Do you want the transatlantic countries to have that kind of grip on the international financial and other systems? This is not in our interest. And therefore, there is no reason for us to applaud this as our press is applauding. They think that this is all something which is affecting Russia. No, it has long-term implications for the rest of the world. And therefore, we have to be very careful in terms of planning ahead as to what we should do. And the answer at the end of the day is Atmanirbharta. There can't be total Atmanirbharta in any case, but to the extent in vital areas we can develop that such reliance, which is very, 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 very important to us. Sorry for the long answer.
Follow-up questions. So I'll ask you a different question, something that people might not generally ask. So throughout your answer, few times you made references to perceptions and narratives, and I got a hint implicit in that perceptions and narratives shape power. As a student of political science, it intrigues me that within the disciplines of the subject, there are certain convergences. For example, political philosophy converges with international relations. As Michael Foucault said, that power exists in the society in the form of discourses. It comes from everywhere, goes everywhere. So sir, what is the role that discourses or narratives play in diplomacy? And then I would bring it, I like to bring it back to India. What could be an ideal discourse for us?
You know, in the 1970s, early 1970s, India, Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister then. We moved this whole business of building a new world information order as far back as then, because the international narratives are controlled by the West. They have grip over the international media, and particularly at that time, since then of course countries have developed their own, in many ways they are not that much now subjugated by Western thinking and Western views, but in the early 70s, that was just 25 years after the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the West as the principal source of power in the world. But that was shut down. That didn't take off at all, because the West, even now, refuses to yield their grip on the circulation of information throughout the world, because through that they control the narratives, as they're doing in the case of Ukraine. And if you read our own press, you will think that that Putin has gone off his mind, he is being defeated, he's bound to be defeated, a huge error he has committed, the Russian economy is collapsing, Putin's hold on power is now in jeopardy, that gross human rights violations are being committed, civilians are being killed without humanity, infrastructure is being destroyed. This is part of the demonization of Russia that I have experienced even when I was ambassador in Russia. They don't want a strong leader in Russia. It's the biggest country in the world, even now after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It sits on huge natural resources, especially hydrocarbons, but other precious, other metals. The West would like to get a grip on that. They want a regime there which would cooperate, collaborate with them and give them access as they want to their raw materials. And Putin is standing in the way. That's why they've always wanted him out. And they've created this narrative where actually they have demonized Putin. And sometimes even those who are less prone to be influenced by such judgments begin to feel there may be some truth in this. Such is the power of the narrative that they have created. Look at our own case. So they have decided that India is a faltering democracy. It's only a sort of electoral democracy, but it's not a real democracy. So VDEM downgrades it. Then this another democracy institute in the United States downgrades this. And then articles appeared in Foreign Affairs of the Council of Foreign Relations that India is no longer a democracy. So this chorus of India, no longer being a member, full member of the democratic world has taken its hold. I can tell you that because I travel a lot abroad. And people, thoughtful people, who are professionals in various walks of life, who may not have a deep understanding of India or international affairs, but they are people who are alive to international trends, and they are quite convinced that India is becoming fascist, and that Modi, BJP, they are fascist leaders. This Hindu nationalism, this is accepted by the elite in the West. Point is, there is nothing that we are able to do against this. I mean, you can write as many articles you want defending yourself, but what circulation do they have? Nothing. And what is worse is, to my mind, is that our own political leaders quote the New York Times repeatedly to slam their own government. Suddenly, and I know New York Times pretty well, I've dealt with them, and I can tell you, they are deeply, deeply biased against India. I've tried to reason with them, it's just not possible. And yet, if New York Times writes an article, it becomes a sort of a biblical reference to our politicians and some activists then who quote New York Times to describe our own country as if we are not able to judge for ourselves what our country is. It's not as if things are all right in our country in every respect. That's not the case. But a sense of proportion, a sense of balance is necessary, but we are not able to create that internationally. And then in addition to this, the problem is that Indians who are in the United States or in Britain, in the academic world, and journalists, they are contributing to this themselves. And therefore the narrative takes deeper hold, because the Indians themselves denigrating their own country and contributing to the negative narrative. So the long and short is that it's the grip of the English language on international discourse that allows the Anglo-Saxon media to shape international narratives against whichever country they want to shape it for political reasons. And India is half a victim of this already. But there's not all that much you can do, especially as our own press and elements in our own society are part of this narrative and promote it. So it's not an easy battle.
In the previous question, Ambassador Sibal gives a very comprehensive evaluation about Russian aggression and the complex geopolitical upheaval taking place in Ukraine. Ambassador, we have been victims of aggression on the eastern flank of our border at the hands of China. The bloody incident at Galwan Valley was followed by a compromise of diplomatic channels which resulted in a long stalemate. One cannot simply turn a blind eye to the growing animosity between India and China. So in this context, how do you read and analyze Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to India? The way I see it, Sino-India relationship has tremendous scope for both compromise and conflict. So how assertive should India be when it comes to tackling China? And what are the possible areas and verticals for collaboration?
Well, it's a complex issue because China is sitting right on top of us. It has claims on our territory. The only two countries which have claims on our territory are China and Pakistan. Both collaborate with each other, both are nuclear powers. That adds to the challenges, security challenges that we face. Insofar as China is concerned, they want to keep India under pressure. People say, and I don't think it's wrong, that the Chinese are very hierarchical in their thinking. And therefore, they feel that China is the principal power in Asia. The only other country, theoretically, which can challenge China by virtue of its size, demography, human resources, and of course a degree of national grit and self-confidence, is India. Therefore, they want to keep India off balance as long as possible, so that they can keep consolidating their power, continue to grow stronger economically, militarily, because they are becoming strong militarily too, and increase the gap between India and China, in the expectation that with that gap in power developing, India will be put in this place. On the other hand, they also know that India is not a security threat to China. China is a security threat to us, but we are not a security threat to China. We ceased to be a security threat in 1954 when we handed over willingly Tibet to China. We agreed that Tibet was part of China. So having conceded geopolitically that extremely vital concession to China, where is the threat? We are actually not in a position to launch an offensive against the PLA in Tibet in order to dislodge it from Tibet, and like Putin has done with regard to Crimea, incorporate Tibet, or if not that, declare it an independent republic and recognize it. This is fantasy. That is what. But to develop that thought, they know that both Xinjiang and Tibet are not reconciled fully to China's occupation. And therefore, they have started changing the demography of these regions, and they have positioned large number of military forces for internal security. But those forces are a threat to India. The moment you have such large military forces stationed near your borders, you are vulnerable. The other is that right in 1959, they decided what in the dark should be theirs, and what in the east should they rightfully claim as theirs. And this is what the game is, and this is what led to Kanwal. That they want to actually establish on the ground what they think is the 1959 line that they have in mind. Because given the kind of 1993, 1996, 2004 or 5, 2012 border agreements that we've had, and this narrative that the line of actual control is not defined on the ground. Both countries have different perceptions of the line of control. So therefore it leaves certain areas as fluid in terms of territorial sovereignty. This is what the Chinese have sought to end by the recent aggression. That this is the line we have in mind, this is ours. What they did not expect was that India would stand up the way India has. In Galwan, I understand it from our policymakers that in their judgment and careful assessments, at least 40 to 42 Chinese were killed in Galwan, although they have acknowledged only 4. They massed 50,000 troops, we have massed 50,000. We have pitched 50,000 troops. 2 winters have gone by, we have not buckled. It has imposed costs on us, but it is imposing costs on China too. Because everything that their forces in such large numbers need has to come from 4,000 kilometers away. Tibet produces nothing. It doesn't even produce noodles. Momos maybe, but forces can't survive on momos. So they have to get this from 4,000 kilometers, so it's a huge burden on them too. I think they didn't expect that. And then finally, in the worst case scenario, supposing they were to take military action, what would happen? They'll gain another 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers. That's it. So from their point of view, is it worth it to engage India in a military conflict, and at the end of it, they'll say that we've got 15 kilometers of barren land? It doesn't make strategic sense from their point of view. Therefore, their strategy is to keep us under pressure. not reach a level where there would be actual conflict. And in actual conflict, they will suffer. As much as we will suffer, they will suffer too. Huge number of casualties. For them, it's much worse. With their one China policy, one child gets lost, the entire genealogy is lost. So there will be a huge domestic reaction if there are a large number of casualties. So we should not be, we should be very watchful in terms of security, but there is no reason to be intimidated by China. Insofar as other issues are concerned, we have a political dilemma. Even in 1962, we didn't break our diplomatic relations with China. So now what do? We are sitting there, it's a threat, we recognize it, our forces are there, confronting each other. Do we break off relations? Not break off relations in the sense, do we lower our relations to a level where actually they become more or less informal terms, meaningless? I don't think Government of India has taken that decision. They have taken some very niche decisions, which is also linked to Atmanirbharta and all that. They reduce our dependence on China on critical supplies, develop our own capacities. That will take time. It can't happen overnight. You've seen a spurt in our trade with China, $125 billion today, and some people do say that there is a contradiction in this. You have military confrontation and expanding economic ties. So what does this say about the rationality of your policy? One way to answer that is that the United States has designated China as its principal adversary. And last year their trade was $657 billion, up from $550 billion the year before. So there are certain realities of this kind on the ground. But if you exclude them from certain areas, the digital area, the reduced role in our telecommunications sector, progressively build our own capacities in our APIs for our pharmaceutical industry. In the power sector, they're already out. They are present, but there are no new projects which they are being given. Screening of investment to make sure that they don't enter into areas which will then make us vulnerable in the future. They have been financing our startups, we have clamped down on that. So these are some of the things that we are doing. But at the same time, in areas where actually they are coming into them, it does not pose a security threat. We are letting them do it, which explains why the trade has gone up to $125 billion. It's a long-term challenge. It's a long-term challenge. And at some stage, we will have a better equilibrium. China has certain timelines where they think they will become the biggest economic power in the world and a formidable military power. Our timelines, if everything goes well, are also that if you look at the reports of the OECD and the IMF, they're all saying that by 2050, India will be the second largest economy in the world after China. So we have waited 3,000-4,000 years already, so let's wait for another 30-40 years.
Thank you so much, sir. You mentioned about military dynamics, even the population control policies that China has implemented. You also talked about why we need to be Atmanirbhar, but interestingly, you did not make any mention about multilateralism and how we can tackle China through multilateral channels. So sir, I want to ask you this question. So an immediate response from the Chinese, when China unleashed its wolf warrior diplomacy in the practical sense, post the COVID outbreak, the manifestations were in Galwan, Senkaku Island, South China Sea and some other friction points. So sir, post these developments, there was a renewed enthusiasm about the Quad. Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon last year at Campus 2021 argued that the stated purpose of the Quad is not to counter China, but to rather ensure that there is peace and tranquility and a rules-based Indo-Pacific. So sir, how do you see the utility of similar multilateral channels, not limited to Quad, and do you think they present any scope for India to counter China?
Before I answer the question, I forgot to answer your question about Wang Yi's visit. Wang Yi, I've written about this also. See, Wang Yi came in the neighborhood, he was visiting Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal. And after what happened in Ukraine and India showing that it was not being browbeaten by the West to take sides against Russia, which actually implied that India still valued the SCO and more than that the BRICS and everything else. He thought that maybe he should come and explore what the Indian thinking might be. Was there now an evolution? Because India would also, as I mentioned earlier, read into the developments that are taking place, the longer term challenges that the countries like India, along with China and Russia and Asian countries and the developing world in general would face. That was one. The other, of course, was that the big summit is to be held, and it was, I suppose, an effort to gauge India's view whether it would be willing to participate in this virtual summit. If he had missed out coming to India, the conclusion would have been that China is now blocked in terms of its policies towards India and is not seeking any particular opening towards India. So that was, but we stood our ground, and our foreign minister was very right in saying that if the situation on the border is abnormal, how can relationship be normal? And this message was reiterated. He didn't get any meeting with the Prime Minister. But we seem to have agreed to this virtual summit, which in my own comments I said there is nothing wrong with it, especially after what's happened against Russia and Ukraine. We have to think long term in terms of alternatives. And the alternatives can only be in Asia. And therefore, even now, even though we have currently serious problems with China, but we should not let the West feel that we have no option. The moment they feel we have no option, they will constrain you even more and corner you even more. Therefore, we must get room for ourselves to be able to pursue our national interests. Now, insofar as multilateralism is concerned, when the United Nations doesn't function, what's the use of multilateralism? That's the core of the issue. In any of the major conflicts that we've seen, the UN has played no role. Post a situation, they play some role. But in terms of build up to the situation, an actual conflict, they play no role. And even Obama, who got a totally undeserved Nobel Peace Prize, I mean, his view was that the United Nations, that US will cooperate with UN if it can, but if not, then they'll do what they need to do. And in all their interventions, there was no UN approved. In the case of Libya, it was only for what is it called? Not allow the Libyan Air Force to attack the civilians. There is a term for that. But there was absolutely nothing in the UN resolution which allowed Europe, France was the first to intervene, to actually take military action in Libya. So the other is that China now has actually become very influential within the UN system. They are the second largest contributor to the UN funding, and there are 3 or 4 UN institutions which they are heading, including the FAO. Since they are the second largest funder, so they are getting money back by grabbing some top posts. They have actually mustered sufficient backing within the UN system to pursue their foreign policy. For example, in the UN Human Rights Commission, when the West moved this thing about human rights violations of Uyghurs, the Chinese were able to get 50 or 56 countries to oppose that, and that including major Islamic countries also. So, when it comes to multilateralism, apart from the fact that it is not working very well, we have also to look at China's increasing influence, which creates a problem for us in terms of the reform of the UN, our bid for permanent membership of the Security Council, which China is delaying and blocking and will not allow. So we have a problem there also with the UN system. And finally, insofar as multilateralism is concerned, from the Indian point of view, has it ever worked for us? In the UN, we've had so many problems on Kashmir, on Pakistan, on this or that. On terrorism, we had made a move for a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. We moved in the middle 90s, and today there is nothing that has happened on that front. When it comes to China's recent aggression, there hasn't been, contrary to what we see in the case of Ukraine, the UNGA and this and that, doing things, there's nothing of the kind. So we have been sanctioned by the United States for about 3 decades, strategically, without any UN approval for these sanctions. So my theory is that we talk about multilateralism. First, we are not given our due role in the United Nations. The UN system itself doesn't work. We have this UN system, to the extent it works against us. You've seen recently the statements of the UN Secretary General, the UN Human Rights Commissioner, even on minor things, minor things relating to our internal situation, they issue statements. But the UN Secretary General doesn't have the courage to say anything about the Uyghurs or the Tibetans. But when it comes to CAA or the Shine Bagh, this and that, they issue. Even in the case of 1 or 2 journalists here and there who are not allowed to go here and there, they issue a statement. So, okay, theoretically, the only multilateral institution we have is the United Nations, but actually the United Nations is not serving either the interests of India or the international community. But I'll add a little caveat to this so far as other UN organizations are concerned, whether it is UNESCO or this or that. And certain aspects of the UN agenda, they do play a positive role. They do play a positive role, and we are very much part of those discussions. This includes climate change also, because it's under the UNFCCC program. So in certain areas, the multilateralism is functioning, though we have to constantly fight for our positions. But on security side, multilateralism hasn't functioned.
For my next question, I'd like to quote Ambassador Sibal's poem. Asking a neighbor not to strike with terror at us is quite like telling a gunman he shouldn't shoot, a raider that he should not loot, a predator that it mustn't prowl, or a jackal that it shouldn't howl. So moving from the eastern flank of our border to the western flank, Pakistan using terror as an instrument of their foreign policy has always been a perennial problem for us. Recent political turmoil has recent political turmoil has led to certain administrative changes in the country, with Mr. Shehbaz Sharif assuming the office of Prime Minister. So, sir, with these recent developments, how does one analyze India's bilateral ties with Pakistan in the short and the long run? What role do you assume China would play in shaping the future of India's relation with its neighbor?
Its neighbors. First of all, this is not the first time that there has been a change of government in Pakistan. So I don't know why we get excited when something happens there and we see an opening. And that lobby which wants to promote a dialogue with Pakistan suddenly gets active and starts writing articles and editorials. This time has come to explore. Now, our Prime Minister did send a message and also sent a letter to Shehbaz Sharif. But in his reply, if you see what he has written, that unless all outstanding issues like Kashmir, which is a core issue, is settled, relations can't move forward, but I want good relations. So it's the same tune. Nothing has changed. And in fact, in his inaugural speech, he spoke about rivers of blood flowing in Kashmir and this and that. We want to overlook all that because it suits the agenda of some people. I think the West, the Americans and the UK in particular, have always favored an India-Pakistan dialogue. And the lobbies who then get activated, apart from our own leftists who have that point of view, this sort of move starts in our media. Now, Shehbaz Sharif is heading a coalition which is as disparate as it can be. There is the PPP and there is Fadul Rahman Singh. When the elections come, if they come shortly, all those will be competing against each other. So it's not a stable coalition. And in any case, they got 174 votes, I think, 174 votes, which is just a majority of 2 in terms of the no confidence motion. It's not as if there was an overwhelming tide in their favor. So they got a thin margin. On top of that, you have this fellow Imran Khan, who is showing his street power and who has the capability of making life difficult for this government. He's already castigating it as an imported government, basically US imposed government. He's got the backing of the Islamists, and the street demonstration in Karachi recently was pretty impressive, as one could see on television. So he will then actually start attacking Shehbaz Sharif if he made any move towards India. Few things. One, they will then ask him, but India has changed the constitution, they're not giving any assurance on Article 35A that there'll be no demographic changes. So there's no concession from India on Kashmir. So on what basis are you reaching out to India? Which means that you've forgotten Kashmir. Kashmir is no longer an issue. He'll have to face that, and Imran Khan would be there to agitate this. Number 2, he has to develop a consensus, even within the ruling coalition, whether the timing is right. To my mind, he should first be more concerned about consolidating his position, making sure that he can run the government until the elections are held. And it will be a constant burden on him to manage this coalition and at the same time prepare himself for elections which will be against the very partners who are in the government. So would he be wanting to complicate his life by injecting into the politics the very sensitive issue of India, especially as on Kashmir, he's not going to get anything from us. Bajwa, that geoeconomics, they're going to focus on geoeconomics and not this and that. That narrative is also collapsing after their attack on Afghanistan recently. fissures are developing even with regard to that. Because the whole idea of geoeconomics was that Afghanistan would be stabilized by Pakistan and Taliban together and opening to Central Asia. Now with the Ukraine crisis, with Russia totally embroiled there, that scenario is also not going to work. So, my own view is ignore Pakistan, let the situation unfold itself. If a chap like Mansha, that industrialist, talks about trade with India, resuming trade with India, says that I manufacture Hyundai cars, I can get spare parts from India at cheaper rates. And then he talks about Pakistani cricketers playing in IPL and Pakistanis participating in Hollywood movies and stuff like that. From a business point of view, it might make sense. But business is not removed from politics. Just to complete this, as you know, even during Imran Khan's time, there was a move to import sugar and cotton from India. And Imran Khan had gone ahead. And when the Cabinet Committee on Economics met, they reversed Imran Khan's own decision. Now Imran Khan is there. So I don't know how this is going to work out. But if, for example, they decide to appoint ambassadors. So far we don't have ambassadors in each other country. But if they take the initiative to send an ambassador, we can reciprocate by sending an ambassador to keep the dialogue channels open. So far as China is concerned, their mischief making will continue. The flagship of China's CPEC, of BRI, is the CPEC. It is not functioning as well as they may have thought, but it is critical for them. You see, the British tried to stop the Russians from getting access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. And Pakistan is now giving China access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. On the other side, Myanmar is giving them access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean in the Bay of Bengal. They are very strongly implanted in Nepal. In Bangladesh, they haven't succeeded fully, but they have not given up. In Sri Lanka, they received a bit of a setback, but nevertheless, they are very much present in Sri Lanka. Maldives received a setback, but we have to see how things evolve. We are on our side, trying to do our best to consolidate our position both in Sri Lanka and Maldives and in Nepal, thinking ahead about the China challenge. So the China challenge is not going to go away. And one final point. No other country in the world ever has developed its naval capacities as rapidly as China has done today. If you look at China, it is virtually a landlocked country. The only access to sea they have is the Western Pacific, where the US 7th Fleet is there, US forces are there, US bases are there, etc., etc. Now, if they're going to build this huge navy, it can't be confined to the South China Sea. It will be sitting ducks. So they have to break through. And they have to come into the Indian Ocean. There is no other place to go. So we have to look ahead. There's going to be a China challenge in the Indian Ocean, for which they were prepared by this maritime Silk Route and all the string of pearl stuff. They will continue in that direction because they have built up those capacities, aircraft carriers, this and that. What are those aircraft carriers going to do in a pond like the South China Sea? It has to come out. So we have a problem, but not for the moment, which is why, to answer your question about Quad and everything, no, I don't agree with Shiv Shankar Menon. The whole genesis of Quad is the China threat. Every part of the agenda of Quad is related to China. Because China seemed to be exploiting the COVID after, they are the source of the COVID, but they were exploiting it by distribution of vaccines and this and that. So Quad decided that they will have cooperation to produce vaccines for the Indo-Pacific in order to deny China the upper hand. When it comes to critical supply chains, which are the critical supply chains? Not Japanese, not Taiwanese, it's the Chinese critical supply chains which the Quad wants to find alternatives to. When it comes to artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and some other advanced technology areas that have been mentioned, 5G, 6G. Where is the challenge coming from? Challenge is coming from China. And therefore the effort of Quad is to marry their resources. And now, yes, in terms of HADR, China is not a factor. In terms of fishing, again, China is doing illegal fishing all over. Even there is a concern, the China concern. But the Quad countries are right in not announcing that it is anti-China in intention. The Chinese know it is anti-China because they have been speaking against it, and they have become more shrill in their opposition to Quad in recent months. The other element in Quad is the climate change discussion. There again, China is not a factor, but that is a point. That is a way of putting pressure on India, because India, before the Glasgow summit, was reluctant in terms of fixing a year for carbon neutral economy, but we have done that, so the pressure is off. But in other ways, the pressure will continue because India relatively is, from their point of view, a big emitter of carbon. But the Quad agenda is very much, yes, and finally, the reason why China is not being targeted openly in statements is because of ASEAN. The ASEAN is very sensitive. ASEAN doesn't want to get caught in the conflicts, in the quarrels between China and the West. And they think that they are the ones who actually are the core of a security architecture in Asia, which is a fact. In fact, even the East Asia Summit is actually something that was developed by ASEAN as a concept. So they feel that with the Indo-Pacific, their centrality will somehow get diluted, which is why in all our statements, including the Americans, we keep saying, ASEAN centrality is recognized, ASEAN is central. Because the whole game is to get some key members of ASEAN to support the Quad or the Indo-Pacific, which is Indonesia and Vietnam, without breaking ASEAN unity. That's what it is.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we should be taking one question from the audience. So I request people who wish to ask a question to Ambassador Sibal to kindly raise their hand.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session. My question to you is that the current foreign policy of India seems to be changing, with India being a friend with Russia and US as well. Which one of these friendships is going to help India more, considering that India does not have any good relations with China, while China has good relations with Russia? Can that angle be harmful to India?
Well, as I explained, we're not a small country where we have to tag on to any big country for our survival, for our growth. In fact, countries are beginning to now realize how vital is India for their own future and growth, economic growth. our human capital, the size of our market, our growing military power, the determination we've shown in the last 75 years to be independent, to have a degree of strategic autonomy. Even if they criticize it, it earns respect for us. That you have to woo India, India can't be treated like Burkina Faso or anything else. Therefore, we must stand our ground, keep building our relations with the United States, but not yield on our relationship with Russia. Because the moment you yield on your relationship with Russia, you have no margin of maneuver left. And then you become like Japan and Germany and Europe. You can have, and these countries are big in economic terms, but they have no independent foreign policy or defense policy. You can only have that if you keep your options open. So in that context, the relationship with Russia is important. Other thing is that it is a fact that Russia-China relationship is going much closer strategically. And my view is that it is actually the lack of geopolitical sense of the West that they have pushed Russia into the arms of China. United States declares China as its main adversary and also says Russia is our adversary. So they treat both of them as adversaries. So instead of breaking them up, they actually push them into relying on each other, which is what has happened. And the United States, despite its power, has no capacity to engage in conflict on both ends of the Eurasian continent, the European end and the Asian end. They don't have the power and the capacity. So our problem is that the Russia-India-China dialogue, which began when I was Foreign Secretary, was actually intended as kind of as a non-Western alternative to international governance. At that time, Russia was the lead player. Because I participated in those discussions, I could see Russia was actually directing the agenda and the most vocal. The Chinese were pretty silent. Since then, the equations have changed. China has outpaced Russia economically by a very wide margin. As well as militarily, they have grown stronger. They're showing their capabilities in space and everywhere else. So what has really happened is in the Russia-India-China triangle, the Russia-China axis has become very strong. The Russia-India axis has become weaker, and the Russia and the India-China axis is in trouble. So what do we do in these circumstances? From our point of view, we have to keep Russia on our side. We have to make sure that Russia continues to feel it has stakes in India, which is the reason why we shouldn't go too far with the Americans. Quite apart from the other reasons I mentioned, this is also a reason. Because if they begin to feel that they are losing stakes in India and India has now walked into the Western camp, whatever little influence or inhibitory influence that they have on China with regard to this triangle will be lost. And China will feel more free to challenge India. BRICS will collapse, SCO will collapse. Which means all the alternative platforms we have created for ourselves in the context of multipolarity or being able to say that we are friends with everybody. We are not going to be followers of anyone exclusively. That entire foreign policy will collapse. So, and finally, we are a nation power. Neither is Europe a nation power, nor is America a nation power. We are a nation power. Therefore, we must have a foothold in Asia. If we alienate Russia, and we have this problem with China, then we lose all our Asian foothold apart from what we call South Asia, where we have problems too. Nepal is a problem for us, Pakistan is a bigger problem. Sri Lanka keeps playing games with us. Myanmar is in the grip of China already. So we want to be present in Central Asia. Central Asia is dominated by China and Russia. So if we have difficult relations with both, we have no locus left in Central Asia, which again is very important for us in terms of Islamism and terrorism and everything else, which with the presence of Taliban in Afghanistan is the real threat, which is being felt by the Central Asians and potentially by us. So that is the reason why we have to play on all platforms as much as we can without alienating anyone. But modulating our policy in a way that where our bigger interests lie, we push those as much as we can with the United States. Where our certain other vital interests are involved, like with Russia, we maintain stability in our ties. And in the case of China, we don't walk into a situation that we lose the capacity to have a dialogue with China, which is what we are doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. That brings us to the end of this fine conversation on India's foreign policy and its international relations, the developments that are shaping the world and how India relates. So, sir, I must say that Compass as a platform, has had a legacy of hosting stalwarts in international relations and foreign policy. We have had Dr. Sahasrabudhe, we have had Ambassador Rao, we have had Ambassador Menon, and it is indeed an honor that we have added you to that list, short list, but again a very good list of stalwarts, and we are indeed honored to have you with us today, sir. And your views had a degree of pragmatism and a realist perspective, which I think is being reinvigorated in India's foreign policy. And I think a stronger push is required in the long term. Thank you so much, sir. And I also want to convey the gratitude on behalf of our college administration and our principal, Professor Anush.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir, for such an enriching session, and thank you for coming to Hindu College. To show our gratitude, may I request Dr. Archana Verma ma'am and President of Caucus, Tanish Gadam, to present a token of gratitude to Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, sir.